This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. Happy to be with you. As always, joined on Wednesdays, as I usually am, by Chad Oban. Chad, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. I usually start out the show talking about how everybody who's listening via Facebook, we have a ton of people who listen to the podcast via Facebook, which is just fantastic. I think they see the episodes pop up in their feed. They're clicking, they're listening. That's great. Encouraging people, though, as always, to subscribe via a podcasting app. If you really want to make sure that, leave it up to chance, leave it up to Facebook's algorithms that they're going to surface the latest episode for you. Instead of doing that, subscribe via an app like Spotify, Pocket. There's a million of them out there. We're on all of them. So if you subscribe that way, then, you can get an alert. It'll be right on your phone whenever you want to listen. You're working out, you're shoveling snow. That's when I listen to podcasts these days, mostly is when I'm out shoveling the snow. If I could hear it over my puffs of heavy breathing, trying to move all that snow out there. But that's a great way
Rob, before we get to our guest, I should tell you that my snowblower didn't start last week when we had our first big snowstorm. And needless to say, my wife was not impressed that I hadn't checked it up to that point. And it's still not running. So I'm just waiting till the next big snowstorm before I get that done. Yeah,
there you go. Well, that's always the right time to look into whether or not your snowblower is going to run is when there's 8 inches of snow on the driveway. That's the perfect time. That's, Do you have an electric start on yours?
Yeah, I do.
Would you plug it into the wall and hit the button?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, man. Yeah. The snowblower I have now is the first one with that feature. Would never buy another snowblower without it.
This is the first snowblower I've ever owned, so I didn't know that there's snowblowers without this feature.
Yeah. Well, the one I had before this, I think, was made by like Stone Age cavemen or something. I don't know. There was a little hamster or something inside it that turned the gears. Anyway, our guest is listening to this like, what did I get myself into? Our guest is Jonathan Holth. He is an entrepreneur and consultant, makes his home in Grand Forks. He started a little company, a little restaurant that you might know called The Toasted Frog. It's a restaurant, the original. It's in downtown Fargo. Started that in 2006 at the young age of 27. I was 4 years into blogging when I was 27. Still didn't have anybody reading yet at then. It took a couple years after that. Anyway, in 2010, they opened a second location in downtown Bismarck, and the most recent location opened in 2014 in Fargo. He's also a co-owner of Urban Stampede Coffee in downtown Grand Forks. He he's a community development manager for JLG Architects, does all sorts of stuff. He's on all sorts of boards. We could go down the list. I don't know how this guy has time for anything. He was also appointed, notably by Governor Doug Burgum, to be on the advisory council for the Office of Recovery Reinvented, which is what we're going to get into. But first thing we wanted to have you on about, Jonathan, is we're hearing everything, and we're interviewing economists and politicians, and everybody's talking about how do we get people back to work? Because there's businesses out there that need people to go and show up for work, and of course, as customers, we want to go into businesses and be served by people. And what's been your experience coming out of the pandemic, working in the hospitality industry, which I think arguably is the most impacted industry by everything that's been going on? How have you guys been handling it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm happy to be here today, and thanks for the opportunity to chat about this. I think there's a couple answers to that question. First of all, I think when nobody saw it coming really post out of the big hit that COVID had on the industry. We were talking about how are we going to get back to our businesses operating as normal after the shutdowns happen. And then when we were able to get to sort of that kind of place, this happened where all of a sudden we just didn't have people, right? And I've heard you guys talk a little bit about it in previous podcasts, that I think there's a number of factors that have contributed to that, specifically in our industry. I think, there were not jobs that were available for a while in our industry. So people were forced, if they wanted to be working, to go look elsewhere. So, the manufacturing industry and other industries, I think, picked up some workers from the hospitality industry. And people probably realized, well, turns out this 8-to-5 gig isn't that bad. We have made the realization that a couple main realizations. First of all, sitting around and waiting for it to correct itself, that's just not going to happen, right? So we're not working under the assumption that we just need some time and all of a sudden these workers will come flocking back. I also don't believe that there's any specific policy changes that are going to just correct this either. I think there's a lot of people that thought, okay, if we end these unemployment benefits, we're going to see this just massive flocking of workers come back. And, it might have helped in some industries. I don't know. It didn't really make an impact in ours, right? We didn't see overnight this rush of applicants come back. So,
although we got to, there's been a lot of programs that continued to, that wasn't the one variable
Sure.
in terms of, because
Sure.
we had the child tax credit,
Yep.
prepayments and
Yep.
a lot of that kind of stuff. So, but sure. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that there's any, to your point, I don't know that there's been one silver bullet for any of this.
Right. And so, the second realization that I think we made pretty quickly was, rather than totally reinvent the wheel in terms of recruiting workers, we made sure to focus on, okay, we better make sure that we are retaining the ones that we do have, that we are taking care of the ones that we do have, because without that core nucleus, we're going to be really screwed here, right? So we focused on that first. So, rather than say, hey, let's throw these crazy signing bonuses out there and see what kind of carrot we can dangle from the end of a stick to try to get people to come through the door, we said, let's make sure that we're taking care of the people that are already in our doors and make sure they don't want to go anywhere. Because that's the other thing, is people, workers kind of recognize now that they can pretty much go work anywhere, right? So the second they're unhappy, it's not difficult for them to go and work somewhere else.
Seller's market.
Yeah. So, we've done some things that I think are a little outside the norm in the hospitality industry, to try to keep people on and maybe recruit some more people too. We've always, since we opened our restaurants, tried to show people that you can have a career in this business. It doesn't have to be just a job. So, I think a lot of times people work in the restaurant industry until they start having a family, and then they say, well, I can't do this anymore. So, we've made sure that we take care of people that want to have families and stay in our business, that they don't have to leave and go to another industry. So, paid maternity leave and parental leave are things that we do, offering full benefits, paying 100% of that, of health insurance costs for some of our employees. We've just found that we needed to do that, and it's helped us keep a high level of retention. So, look, are we doing the things that other companies are doing to try to recruit people by, posting a bunch of ads and offering sign-on bonuses and increasing wages? Sure. But we also don't have any, misconceptions that people are going to look at that as the end all be all, and I'm going to come to work now at the Frog versus somewhere else. So we've just tried to focus on the people that are already working for us and make sure that they're taken care of.
So, Jonathan, I was excited about having you on the podcast today, and you sort of hit on it before we went on air. Some of us have sort of a D or an R leaning, and we look at the world through certain prisms. And I always find that you look at community first, right? That's the sort of lens you use and the people who live in a community. And I think about the hospitality industry in Bismarck. Mm-hmm. Downtown Bismarck with the Frog, Progue, Noodle Zip, Blarney Stone, Fireflower, all those different places. That greatly enhances my quality of life and my family and friends' quality of life. Mm-hmm. Are you concerned at all that some of those businesses, frankly, aren't going to make it because of the lack of staff or sort of the post-COVID world? And do you think that affects our ability to recruit people from out of the state to come in here? When somebody's coming here to be a doctor, they're not wining and dining them at Ground Round, right? No offense to Ground Round, but I think that's just such a big part of what our value here. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think that it's going to have an impact. Am I fearful that we're going to lose a lot of those businesses? I am. We've seen in different parts of the country, we saw it happen faster than I think where we've seen it in North Dakota. But when the shutdowns first happened with COVID, I started talking about this, saying like, look, there's going to be some businesses that fail right now because they're just going to say, I just can't do it. But there's also a lot of businesses that, in order to make it through that, and in order to make it through some of these workforce challenges, have taken on a bunch of debt. That's been their answer to do it, right? And that eventually that bubble bursts, right? And that doesn't happen over. There was economic injury disaster loans and the PPP loans and everything like that. People were doing whatever they could to stay open, and I think some of those payments are starting to happen now. You got to start paying back some of that debt. So I think we haven't seen it yet, really, the impacts of that's going to happen. And to your point about the bigger picture, I mean, Chad, you've known me for a long time and know that I've always been an advocate for this quality of life stuff as sort of this, you might call like intangible stuff that has a significant impact on our ability to recruit people to this state. Like, people need stuff to do. They want excitement in their lives, right? And so it's not just the hospitality industry. It's other quality of life amenities, businesses that are struggling right now. I mean, I don't know of many restaurants that haven't had to change their hours of operation in the past few months, including ours, right? I mean, we had the same model with the exact same hours for 14 years without having to change it once. And we've had to do reduced hours at multiple locations just to keep our employees happy. I mean, we gave the option to our current employees, look, we can't get people hired. We'll give you the choice. We're happy to pay you a bunch of overtime if you want it, but we're also happy to close down more and give you time off if that's what you prefer. And they unanimously chose time off. Like, they said, I don't care about the extra money. I just don't want to. I want to rest a little bit. So that's what we did. We closed down an extra day, and at our Fargo location where we've served lunch for years now, we're not serving lunch right now because we just don't have the people for it. That's just the world that we're in right now.
How do you square? Because it's nice to say, we want to keep, we want to retain people, we want to hire new people by paying more and offering these extra benefits, but that has a cost, right? There's no free lunches. And for a business, we talk about businesses that were maybe already on the edge and had to go into debt to keep the doors open or couldn't keep the doors open. They got to be hearing that, thinking, I already can't make ends meet. How am I gonna expand benefits for employees that in a lot of ways are very transitory, right? I mean, can move in. I mean, I know you're big on trying to keep them long term and show them that could be a career, but those sorts of jobs, there tend to be a lot of people in and out. Tends to be a lot of turnover. So how do you, how does a business owner, because that seems to be the, like, one side, I think, to Chad's point, talking about, sort of looking at it maybe through a political lens or an ideological lens, like the conservative argument is, we got too many government benefits floating around, and that's disincentivizing work. So let's cut back on the expansions of those benefits. The left side is well, increase pay, right? Like, pay more benefits, more flexibility, doing all these things. But I don't know that that's, obviously you're making that argument, but I don't know that that's a silver bullet. Where does that money come from?
Yeah, and I'm not making that argument and saying that it's just something that you can just do and wave a magic wand. You're right, Rob, that that money has to come from somewhere. I mean, I don't think anybody will tell you that, they went into the restaurant business to print money or to retire early. I mean, it's a thin margin business as is, right? So, the fact of the matter is if you combine the workforce shortages with supply chain issues right now and cost of goods sold, like those margins are going away quickly if they're not gone already for a lot of restaurants. And really, you can't do it without increasing the cost to the customer. So then it becomes a formula, or trying to figure out a formula of how do you do that without without shocking the system, so to speak, right? So, we've tried to be transparent with our customers when we've had to do price increases to say, like, look, we don't want to do this, but it's literally the only way to keep the doors open, right? So, but we've done things like, rather than double the price of a menu item, we'll just eliminate it because we know that a customer won't pay for that if it gets to a certain price point. But that, this ties into the discussion that I like to have too when we start to talk into the raising the minimum wage argument. And that whole debate is that, as much as I, would like to raise wages for everybody, it can't just happen without having significant impacts on the customer. So we need to talk about that as a part of that conversation. But we've had to raise prices. Like there's no way around it. We've looked at, there are things that you can do on the back end. You can look at different suppliers. But if you start to do that too much, now you're talking about compromising quality, and then you're losing your customer anyway. So raising prices has to be a part of the equation, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think this whole conversation, I mean, it's no different than childcare. I mean, we want to pay childcare workers more money. In order to do that, you have to charge people more, and childcare is already too expensive, right? I mean, you have to make the money to Rob's point, the money has to come from somewhere. And in terms of raising menu prices, I'm a North Dakota native. I know when you raise the steak prices a couple bucks, I'm assuming you hear about that, Jonathan.
Oh yeah, it's do. We do. That's why we try to do it, rather than just raise it $5 overnight.
I see Jonathan got my email. I see.
I'm
kidding.
We'll raise it a quarter every couple of weeks for a few weeks to see if people notice. That's the method that. Now I just gave away our secrets, right? But but people do notice that and they complain about it, right? And I'm sensitive to that. Like, look, right. I have a family with 3 young kids that I'm on a budget. Like I get that. And that's the tough part, right?
And Jonathan, you brought up, sort of quality. I mean, eventually you run into having more pre-made sort of processed stuff rather than homemade, made in the restaurant, correct? I mean, that's the other option.
That is the other option, and that some restaurants are going to more of that for 2 reasons. Number one, because it's cheaper, to buy those products that are lesser quality, manufactured somewhere else, right? Versus making it from scratch in your kitchen. But it also getting those products in, it's less hours that your staff has to put into prepping it, right? So I mean that restaurants like ours, where we have people working in the kitchen from the early morning just to prep the food for an evening service, like that's one way that you can shave a couple hours off when you're in a workforce shortage, is to buy something that's already prepared. We don't like to do that. I think the customer notices the difference, but sometimes you don't have a choice.
It seems to me, and this one of the reasons why I oppose, things like raising the minimum wage or some of the other government interventions, is because this stuff is so hugely complicated. And there are so many trade-offs where if you drive up wages, you're going to drive up costs. That's reality. The money has to come from somewhere. And so the problem is when the government comes in and does things, they do it for everybody, right? It's like, this is the law, this is the mandate, everybody's got to do it this way. And that's it. And it doesn't leave a lot of room for flexibility sometimes. And so I guess looking at this conservatively, I don't begrudge workers wanting to get paid more. I think we maybe... I feel like in some ways the pandemic hastened a correction in our society and our economy that was already coming. I think the way Americans live their lives have changed. The expectations that Americans have for work-life balance has changed. My father, I know my father's idea of work-life balance is even very different from mine, and mine's even very different from younger generations. So I understand that, and I don't begrudge anybody wanting to have a different relationship with their employer. I get that. I guess my argument is this is a correction that's happening, and I think it gets obscured somewhat because it's happening in the context of the pandemics. Everything just kind of gets lumped on that. I feel a lot of this was coming anyway, and I guess I don't know how you feel about it. I feel a lot of this was coming anyway, and it's just a correction we need to allow to happen, because at the end of the day, people are still going to want to eat food. Right? Like, demand for food is not going away.
I hope so.
And people are still going to want to go to restaurants and stuff. I don't think that's going away. It's just the business models are going to have to shift a little bit. And I think maybe that's what you're talking about. To my mind, it's let's just try to be hands off and let the workers and the employers and the businesses work this out.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of something that was already coming, I would, I could make the argument that it was something that was overdue. I think that, it's, I, you know, when I've talked about the minimum wage discussion, like I, I personally am in favor of raising the minimum wage, but not all at once, not in a huge chunk. That's where I get fearful of the impacts that it could happen. Um, but I also think too that I mean, one of my favorite pastimes is defending millennials because I think, I get so frustrated with,
I hope I didn't come off as being critical. Like I'm not
no,
judging them.
no, you're not. I'm talking just in general.
Yeah.
Like I get really frustrated when we talk about like younger people and a different work-life balance, like it's a bad thing, right? I mean, they're just different. Like I'll tell you, like at my day job, at in the architecture firm I work for, like I work with about 75% millennials and younger people, and they're some of the hardest workers that I've ever seen in my life, right? Uh, they're really, really hard workers. They're fantastic people, but just because somebody looks at something differently, like I think it's on our employers to adjust to that and to be respectful of that. So we've tried to do that at the restaurants too. And going back to what we were talking about other benefits and things like that, we've tried to get creative with the type of benefits that we offer and the type of time off that we offer, because I think people just look at that differently. We talked a little bit at the beginning about recovery, and so like for example, we approach that much differently in our workplace than I think most employers do. But that's a benefit to our employees, that we've been able to retain a lot of employees because of our approach to that.
So, Jonathan, on that front, and sort of pivoting to recovery, Reinvented, you keynoted the First Lady's recent conference,
Yeah.
and I thought your speech was great. And one of the things that really stuck with me was your line where you essentially said, "Addiction does not discriminate, but recovery does."
Yeah.
And that through your recovery, you identified privilege that you had in terms of health insurance, employment, whatever. Can you talk a little about, just expound on what you're sort of starting to get into there in terms of an employer's role
Sure.
because if you can't afford to get treatment, because you can't pay your mortgage or feed your family, what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah. And I talked about, my story, I mean, I'm coming up in May, it'll be 14 years in recovery for me. And, when I got sober and realized I needed to do that almost 14 years ago, I mean, I had all the pieces in place to be successful. I had a job waiting for me. Like I didn't lose a paycheck when I was in treatment. I had health insurance that, covered most of my treatment expenses. And even with all that, like, it was still really hard to stay sober, and it was hard to get sober and stay sober. So, if any one of those things would have fallen off the table, I likely wouldn't be here today. And so I talk about the role of employers in this. The first thing is, I think we're past the point of how it used to be where you separate your personal life from your work life, right? And whatever's happened in your personal life is not my problem as an employer. With the mental health challenges that we have in this country right now, like we just can't do that anymore. Like we need to be supportive of people in all places and in all venues. And, one of the things I brought up at Recovery Reinvented is if we think about like the American construct of a work day, like, we spend on any given day 8 hours with our coworkers and our employers, and then we go home and we'll spend a few hours with our family and go to bed. So we spend a lot of time, oftentimes more time, with our coworkers than we do our own families. So why haven't we taken the steps to really train people in our workplaces and our employers to be looking for warning signs and looking for places where they can help out? And, we're kidding ourselves if we think that what's happening at home or outside of the workplace doesn't impact somebody's productivity in the workplace. So we've supported people getting help and getting through treatment, and it's they're twice as productive as they were after they get sober and get healthy. So that's a financial benefit to me, right? As an employer, like I see loyalty and productivity just skyrocket. So we've taken steps to just help people get through that.
The libertarian in me, I think, has really enjoyed seeing our society take a less puritanical view of that, you know, almost like if you have these problems that you're in some way like a bad person, right? Or there's something inherently wrong with you. And we've really, I mean, this can happen to anybody. And I think we've started to learn. You start looking back at a lot of historical figures who, you know, people didn't know had addiction problems. So I mean, I like that. Even right here in North Dakota, we watched our tax commissioner, our now former tax commissioner, Ryan Rauschenberger, struggle right out in the open. And I actually, I mean, taking all partisan politics and everything else out of it, I like the fact that he got another shot. I don't think, you know, I know a number of our lawmakers have gotten DUIs at one point or another. I don't think that's immediately disqualifying. It's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's something that they need to be honest about and to confront and to be held accountable for. But I like that we're not taking such a puritanical attitude. It's just, this can happen to anybody. Anybody can have an addiction problem. People you know have addiction problems. It's not a bad thing. It's a thing that we can deal with if we make. But I feel like that's step one. It's just, let's just make room for that understanding. Let's make room for recovery to happen, and not immediately you're going to be fired because you're struggling with some sort of an addiction.
Yeah, that part, I mean, is just, and I think to your point, Rob, I think we've made huge strides as a society in that area. I think the conversation about it today versus even when I got sober 14 years ago it's night and day, the difference about it. Like when I got out of treatment 14 years ago, I hid it for a long time because I was so worried about even people that I loved and knew well judging me, right, for having to be in that place in the first place. I see a lot of change in that, and I credit the governor and the first lady for bringing this conversation to the forefront. I think it starts with conversations. I think it starts for a lot of people with them being able to see someone that they can relate to, or someone that's quote unquote normal that's gone through this, and say like, oh, okay, maybe I can come through on the other side too. Having said all that, like, we have a long way to go, right? So I've had these conversations with a lot of other employees talking about the steps that we take at the Toasted Frog to help get people sober, and I've been shut down by a lot of people saying like, yeah, I mean, that sounds way too messy. I don't want to get involved, right? So we've got a long ways to go.
Well, speak to, like, I kind of think that one concern is like liability issues, right? I mean, let's face it. I mean, and again, depending on the type of employer or whatever, I mean, you can't have people driving around a forklift,
sure,
drunk. I mean, I understand that, but I mean, a lot of them got to be just thinking like, I don't want the liability of opening that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and well, you know, I think there's not, you know, there's two separate conversations. I mean, one, like having people, you know, using or intoxicated at work is one thing. Like we don't tolerate that, right? I mean, so. But, you know, helping people get through that time, knowing when they have an issue that needs correcting, you know, to what Chad brought up is oftentimes, you know, there are a bunch of barriers that prevent people from getting help. First one of them is they think they're going to lose their job, right? So, you know, if we can get employers to just communicate to people right out of the gate, here's the deal. If you need to get help, you're not going to lose your job. Your job will be waiting for you when you get back. We want you to be better, right? But then oftentimes people will say, well, that's great, but I can't afford to take 30 days off of work. I won't be able to pay my rent. I'll lose my apartment, whatever it may be. So, you know, what we do is we say, great, we're going to pay you when you're in treatment. That's fine. You're not going to lose a paycheck. So you don't have to work. You don't have to sacrifice financial well-being for your overall well-being. And like people talk about, you know, that sounds like a significant cost. I mean, it's not. It's 30 days, right? And it's not like I have thousands of employees that are doing this. And then we just, you know, make sure that they know that they have support when they get back. Like if you need to take time off to go to meetings, to do aftercare, whatever, you're not going to get punished for that. So it's not like we're not doing groundbreaking work in this space. We're just looking at the barriers that prevent people from getting help and looking at it. How can we assist as an employer? It doesn't cost us very much at all, but we get a really loyal, productive employee on the back end if we can help someone get to that space.
Well, that's the thing too. Is I mean, there's a cost if somebody is I don't mean to cut you off, Chad, but if somebody's the one thing is replacement cost is a real thing. If you have somebody who's an excellent cook or excellent at whatever it is, turning the widget or whatever there is they're doing for you, you know, paying for 30 days for them to go to treatment and maybe giving them some time off so that they can go to meetings or do some of the other things they need to do after that could be less than it costs to go out and find somebody new, or maybe find multiple somebody's news if some of the hires don't work out, and train them and get them to that level of experience when you could have just stuck with the same person in the first place.
And I have plenty of examples where it's not could be less. It is less. I mean, it's just flat out like the cost of training somebody and getting them up to speed. It's just it saves us money in the long run, right?
So Jonathan, I agree with you. The work that the governor and the first lady are doing on Recovery Reinvented is really great work, and that we have a lot of work to do. And I think what they've done is sort of raise this issue and made it more mainstream. And I think that's the first step. Yep. Is that committee starting to talk about what are potential policy changes that can take place, right? Is there a way to, if a business isn't willing to do what the Toasted Frog is doing, is there ways to incentivize that, right? Because until we get to a place where people are comfortable, like they can get recovery. I mean, again, it goes back to your point, no discrimination for addiction, but there is discrimination with coming from recovery. I think at some point we need to move forward with some policies that are people friendly, to move that stuff forward. And and frankly, you said it doesn't cost that much money, and I wish every business would do it. But to the point earlier, when businesses are barely making it the way they are, it can cost some money. So do you see there a role for government? Here's my leftist side of things, Rob.
Yeah.
A role for government
this is the part where Rob gets
incentivizing this?
Well, I start itchy hives. Ugh. I'm kidding.
Yeah, no, I don't know the answer to that, Chad. I mean, I think my general answer would be, is there a role for government? I think the argument that I made in my keynote at Recovery Reinvented is if we really want to make change here, that there's a role for everybody, and there has to be a role for everybody. Our committee, the Advisory Council for Recovery Reinvented, has not gotten into policy. To be honest, I think you probably you might have some people that might not want to be on the committee if we got there into that. I mean, these are we're a group of people that have been through this before and represent different facets of the recovery community. I think the steps that we've tried to take, and I touched on it just a little bit ago, is it starts, to your point, with a conversation and making it more mainstream. But we've done a lot of programming around Recovery Reinvented events where we get CEOs of larger companies in North Dakota in a room and try to explain this stuff to try to make change in the private industry level. Because if we can do that, I think we'll see a significant difference. I mean, this is really an area that employers have just not wanted to touch at all for so long, and I think we've seen damage from that. And I don't think it was with negative intentions. I think it's just one of those things like, that's personal stuff that's separate from what I'm trying to do. So we've really tried to take the approach of educating people in different spaces. So we've met with HR professionals, CEOs, and also just, looking at ways that we can continue to bring the conversation to new places where it currently isn't happening, right? So, not everybody can go to a conference in Bismarck. Not everybody can watch it a full day live stream event, right? So what do we need to do to take this into people's backyards and talk about it more? So that's been our approach to this point.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you for your time. You gave us a half hour, and I appreciate it. And you're a businessman, so I'm sure you got other stuff to do than talk to a couple of bearded podcasters. Here's
the deal. It's about time Rob and I got to talk about food for 20 minutes
that's right.
on this podcast.
Yeah.
I don't need any more time talking about food. I need less food. In fact, these price increases for food are probably going to be good for me in some ways, because I need to eat less of it. That sounds terrible. All right, Jonathan, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Well, I thought that was a very good interview. We spend so much time talking about issues like that, through the lens of sort of kind of bloodless policy, right? And I think it's good to talk to somebody who's on the ground trying to do some innovative things, that work for him. Maybe what he's doing, maybe other businesses can emulate that. Maybe they got to do a different thing. Maybe they can't do it. I don't know, but there's no easy solutions to this. But I always think it's helpful to talk to somebody like that who's in the trenches and he's doing it and saying, listen, we're doing this. This is what's working for us. This is what our challenges are. That to me is very interesting.
Well, and again, he's living it day to day, looking at this through the lens of his community and his employees and whatever. And I think that obviously gives a different perspective. I also think like his perspective on minimum wage is interesting as somebody who owns a restaurant. He's not necessarily opposed to the minimum wage, but he thinks we have to have a conversation that includes the cost, right? You can't increase over here and not increase over here. And we just need to be transparent and as a society make a decision if that's what we want to do or not. But you can't just talk about one side, not the other side.
Yeah. And that's I talk about that all the time. I mean, on my, there is no such thing as a free lunch is important. Like everything has a cost. Everything's got to come from somewhere. And that's got to be a part of it. So I think we're going to finish out the show talking about January 6th. The anniversary of the Capitol riot is tomorrow as we're recording this on the 5th. And obviously there's a lot going on in Congress about it. The January 6th committee is about to get a lot more public. And I've had some, for one thing, I want to stand by my track record of urging Republicans to take that seriously and to confront the reality of what happened. And a lot of them haven't. They either want to ignore it or they're pandering to the base that wants to believe that Trump did nothing wrong, which I think is problematic. But part of what bothers me is we're talking about, and Chad, you flagged one of my columns where I wrote about this a little bit, is that sometimes we talk about January 6th in a vacuum, ignoring a lot of the things that led up to it and ignoring the fact that political violence in some ways has become bipartisan. And I think it's incumbent on, if we make it just so overwhelmingly about January 6th, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not expanding the conversation, not by way of excusing what happened on January 6th, but by saying, listen, all of this has to stop. And some of the points I made was like, the pipeline protests. I mean, I still see people to this day, including like media people who will talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline protests here in North Dakota as though that they were mostly peaceful, which when you jibe that with the days and days of violence and fire and all the other stuff that we saw was not true. And so I think there's there is for people who are saying that we're so razor focused on January 6th and we're having a double standard, for the people on the right who are making that argument, insofar as they aren't making it as a way to excuse what happened on January 6th, I feel like they have a point. Political extremism is a problem across the board in our country.
Yeah, so first of all, I agree. There's a lot to unpack there between January 6th and the pipeline and others. And so I agree, violence and that sort of behavior isn't going to move us forward, right? And I think that there's a lot of rhetoric that sort of incites that violence. As far as January 6th, I just saw a video this morning of comparing Republican leaders, what they were saying on January 7th of last year to what they're saying in December of last year. And it's a Kevin McCarthy. It's like it's a different world. And it's because all the people who stood up to Trump over January 6th are largely gone, right? I mean, they're not running for re-election. They've been kicked out, that kind of thing.
The ones that are hanging on, like someone like Liz Cheney, has been ostracized by her own state political party, and who knows if she can even get reelected. I don't know. But
I also think like January 6th didn't just poof happen, right, on its own. There's a rally at the state capitol, a Stop the Steal rally shortly after the election. And this wasn't just like, people on the far right. I mean, John Hoeven was there, Kelly Armstrong was there, Brent Sanford was there, Kevin Kramer was there, and other elected officials as well. That kind of stuff and the rhetoric that was used at that, not necessarily by those elected officials, but the people at this rally sort of led up to that January 6th sort of violence that we saw, and I want us to be very careful not to get in a position where it's like very good people on both sides sort of thing, right? I mean, all of these things are.
No, I'm arguing different. There's very bad people on both sides.
yeah, exactly. It's just the opposite. But I think even like with the pipeline protests, I mean, you said by and large, most of the time it was violent. I disagree with that.
Well, I didn't say most of the time. I said their argument was that it was mostly peaceful. And
Okay.
I think if you look at the reality, the whole arc of what happened, were there some people there who never committed acts of violence? Were there many days during the months-long protests where there wasn't any violence? Yes. You also can't ignore the rock throwing and the fire set and all the rest of that.
Yeah, I think what people forget, though, is that protest in that camp started long before there was any sort of people paying attention to it. I remember KX doing a story, and there was like a half dozen people down there who started this thing.
I remember I wrote about it in August of that year, and the first thing was when the chairman at the time, David Archambault, was arrested. But I looked at that, and even then, they were trying to instigate, they were trespassing and trying to instigate conflict with law enforcement, which I thought was wrong. Like what frustrated me about it is a refusal to acknowledgement that was a tactic. We're going to get attention by instigating conflict with law enforcement that didn't need to happen and wouldn't happen at a truly peaceful protest. That was my problem.
And it was a tactic, right? At some point, if you're not getting the attention you need to get your point across, you're going to do things. But we also saw, out-of-state folks come in. I remember looking out my office window, and there was a march going on through downtown Bismarck. I've been in North Dakota for a long time. I didn't recognize one of those people that had like a pig's head on a stick and other sort of craziness. And I also don't think we can forget about the fact that if the pipeline company and the state government might have done a better job on the front end of having conversations with the tribes, we might not have led to that point. We saw Doug Burgum and his staff person, Levi Bachmeyer, after he was elected, go down there and really calm things down quickly. And I think that...
I think that's a fair criticism, although you can't ignore the fact that the Public Service Commission, or just as one example, invited the tribe to meetings, and the tribe refused to show up. So,
sure.
It's hard to have a conversation with somebody who won't talk to you either. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and I don't want to spend this segment relitigating DAPL.
I don't either.
My point was yes, there were peaceful people, and there were people, although I might disagree with their position on pipelines, they have every right in the world to express that lawfully and peacefully and without hurting other people and without hurting other people's property. No problem with that at all. The problem I had is that we're holding up. Is it any different to say that DAPL was mostly peaceful than to say that January 6th was Antifa or January 6th wasn't as violent as the news media making it out to be? I see a disconnect in both cases. And it seems like sometimes it can seem like on one side of that, the right-wing disconnect gets a lot of attention and the left-wing disconnect doesn't. Because it's not just DAPL. It's, we're burning down police stations. We're doing all this other stuff. And yes, Fox News exaggerated that stuff. And that was a bunch of nonsense. But it did happen. There were some real problems there. And, it's sort of like, well, if it's right-wingers, that's a problem. And if it's left-wingers, well, maybe it's just something that needed to happen.
I also think, I agree with, like the Fox News. I remember hearing stories about people saying, don't go to Portland. The whole city's on fire. And then I talk to people who are in Portland who are like, I don't know what they're talking about. But I also think, I have a tough time getting in the shoes of African Americans who are seeing people who look like them get shot and killed by police unprovoked, right? So I don't know that I'm comfortable suggesting that they're overreacting or whatever. I'm not getting shot and killed, right? My family's. Okay. I don't like it.
Oh, see, that's the problem. Every time we have this conversation, people start making excuses. I'm sorry. You're scared. You believe your cause is just, so you're going to put a brick through your neighbor's shop window?
Yeah, I think your point is a very good one, Rob. I don't think the tactics of burning down a police station and throwing rocks through windows is the right approach. I also think trying to throw over the government is a little bit different than we're trying to end democracy is a little bit different. And I think there's probably people who went to January 6th in a peaceful way, right? It wasn't like every person that was at January 6th was running through the Capitol.
I think some of them went there thinking they were just going to go to a rally for the president who they supported. Maybe they didn't think that it was going to end up with a bunch of people bum rushing Congress.
Yeah, I can't believe, I think Tom Campbell was there, that Tom Campbell was going there with the idea that he was going to bum rush the Capitol, right?
Former.
So I think, your overall point, if we can figure out a way to get to the point where we're where we're not having violence, where we're not breaking people's property, we're not burning things down. That's the ultimate goal. And I think part of it comes through communication and talking to each other. But it's similar to the conversation we had with Jeff Hoverson, right? I mean, if you're working off of a different set of facts, how the hell are you supposed to talk to each other, right? I mean, if you've got Black Lives Matter and the other side of things are saying, thin blue line, and somehow those two sides can't talk to each other, what do you do?
Right. Well, I mean, a part of the Black Lives Matter movement became defund the police, right? And I mean, that's fizzled because that's obviously not a practical solution. As a matter of fact, if you listen to a lot of groups that are maybe outside of that activism, but are still members of those Black communities or other people of color communities, I mean, they're saying, no, we want the police here. In fact, we want more police and better funded police and better trained police who maybe use different tactics and different approaches and have different training than what we have now. So
yeah, and I thought the whole messaging around defund the police was just ridiculous, right? I mean, that's not going to appeal to middle of the road people. What we want to do is invest more in police, and specifically in the tactics they're using. I mean, I get we don't want to just pour more money into doing the same things we've always done, but there's other de-escalation things that we can do and that kind of thing. And especially when we're seeing issues with crime going up in a lot of communities right now. And that I know there's people on the left who are mad that we're not doing more to get more cops into some of these places where we're seeing an increase. Defund the police was never going anywhere. The slogan was terrible. And so I think that looking at police reform is an important thing, right? I mean,
yeah. Let's zoom out again a little bit, because let's
okay.
whatever the topic is, like maybe it's a pipeline, maybe it's policing, maybe it's the election. It seems to me that people right and left, a lot of people, have convinced themselves that through sheer force of numbers, they can just impose their will on everybody else. That to me seems to be the common theme. We can just block all the pipelines. We don't have to compromise with the people who say, hey, we need oil, or the people who work in the oil industry, or the landowners who wanted to get paid to have the pipeline come through. We don't have to compromise with any of those people. We'll just show up. We'll be violent enough. We'll be difficult enough, and we'll get our way. Or we think the election was stolen, so we'll show up with Congress, and we'll be belligerent enough and angry enough and loud enough that we'll just get our way. That is a fundamentally undemocratic notion, because the problem is at the end of every debate, the Black Lives Matter and the thin blue line people got to still live together. You still got to live in the same community. So what sort of an outcome are you going to get that you can all at least live with?
So I think one of the issues is these tactics work, right? I mean, they've been effective in some places. I mean, you think about January 6th. I mean, we're still talking about January 6th. Those people who broke down, I mean, again, going back to Kevin McCarthy and others, their whole position has changed. I mean, Trump is still saying the election was stolen.
Months after Kevin McCarthy said that Donald Trump was responsible for the riot. Months later, he's down in Florida seeking and receiving the president's blessing or his endorsement, coming out of it saying it's probably the most important endorsement a Republican can receive. That is craven. I look at what Republicans have done, and it is just absolutely craven. And I'm wondering when any of them, well, and obviously there's been some, but what are they gonna? But you're right, it works because who are all the? I think a lot of the Republicans who are pandering, they know damn well what January 6th was. Sean Hannity, we've seen the texts now. Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, they knew damn well what it was. They make excuses for it, but what they're afraid of is the base. That's what they're afraid of.
And I think if you're going to win a national primary on for either party, you need to, unfortunately, I mean, you need to get engaged in these sort of, I don't want to say radical, but sort of the sort of thing that give juice to the base on both sides. And not to mention, I mean, I hate to be the guy who sort of talks trash about the media, but I mean, you talked about like the Portland riots. I mean, those things get just exaggerated into something huge. And so it creates a situation where politicians have to respond. And so it's just this big circle. And so I think with so many things, Rob, that you and I talk to, it really comes down to the adults in the room and the adults in elected position to just sort of calm things down. But unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are just pouring gasoline on this stuff in order to get clicks, in order to raise money, in order to be on MSNBC or Fox News.
Well, and it's not, I don't know even that it's a top-down problem per se. I think it's very much a bottom-up. I think a lot of the anger is coming from the grassroots. And this is anathema to the way we usually talk about politics, which is listen to the people, the consent of the governed, the wisdom of the masses. Well, what if the masses, what if it's 40% who want to try to impose their will on the other 60% all the time? What if it's the 30% who are against building pipelines trying to impose their will on everybody? I mean, how do you, because it seems to me that's who everybody's pandering to. And they just want things that they don't want to compromise.
I wouldn't suggest these people are the masses on either side, right? It's a really, really vocal minority. And the normal people who are just worried about getting their kids to school on a blizzard day or getting their kids to soccer practice or paying their mortgage, they're not engaged in this stuff. They're not paying attention. I would guess the vast, vast majority of people woke up this morning not thinking about tomorrow being the anniversary of January 6th.
I can buy into that. The thing, though, is that one of the reasons why if that were true, I don't think the politicians would be as reactionary to this stuff as they are. And I think one of the reasons they are reactionary is that vocal minority can swing elections.
Absolutely. And that's who shows up. That's who shows up at primaries, right?
Right.
But it is a vocal minority. And I also know, in the state, when legislators get 5 emails on a subject, they freak out and they feel like there's a grass fire going on in an issue. I think everybody has to just take a deep breath and maybe think about the big picture a little bit more.
I wrote something about that earlier in the session, and it was referring to sort of Edmund Burke had an idea about public service that, well, he was the was he Scottish or English? Now I'm not remembering. I think he was Scottish. Anyway,
let's say Scottish.
He was an Enlightenment thinker, and he had a notion of public service, which was that somebody who's elected owes their constituency their reason, not their obedience. So the idea was, you elected me, and I'm going to go and I'm going to exercise my reason as best I can in office to serve you. But I'm not just going to poll test everything. And I'm not just going to sway in the wind every time 5 people show up in my office or I get a dozen emails on something. And obviously he was like 18th century, so he's not talking about emails, but it's the same idea. It's where I'm not going to just sway in the wind. I'm going to make my decisions and then explain myself on election day. And if they want me to keep doing what I'm doing, then they'll let me know. I think we need more of that. But because I think the information, everything is so immediate, right? Lawmakers can see the Facebook comments immediately. They can see the tweets immediately. They get the emails immediately, and they react to it. And that has in turn made them reactionary.
And they react based on sort of where they're at. I don't know how often I've talked to legislators who, depending on where their ideology lands, they're getting too many emails, and that's why they're voting the wrong way or whatever. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, I mean, if all we need is all we have is legislators who tally up how many messages they get from their constituents. I mean, we might as well just have computers there voting, right? And at the end of the day, they can tally.
Well, we may as well just have direct democracy. We'll just put every bill on an online poll, and all the North Dakotans can log in and vote on it, and then that'll just be the law.
Yep. But because the people, again, who are contacting legislators on sort of some of these hot button issues, these aren't necessarily people who, these are people who are engaged in the process and have strong opinions, and it's a minority, right? And we're not talking about a huge sum of people who are pushing these buttons.
Do you feel, and again, getting back to my, I guess, argument that it's a bottom-up issue more than a top-down issue, and again, I don't think anybody who has to actually get elected is not going to go out there and blame this problem on the people. But it's a bottom-up problem. And I don't know how I wish it was a top-down problem, because a top-down problem I feel like would be easier to fix. I don't know how we fix the bottom-up problem other than to tell politicians to be less reactive to the people they're hearing from the most.
Yeah, because I agree with that. I mean, when so much of this is happening in social media bubbles where you only talk to people you want. I mean, I've talked to people in small towns before that, there's a time where at the local cafe or the local bar, people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents would sit around a table and would argue with each other about policy because they're neighbors and they care about these things. And now it's like you've got a table full of Republicans here, a table full of Democrats over there, and they're just sort of bitching about each other from once. Maybe I should watch my language on your podcast.
I don't know.
One side of the room to the other, right? I mean,
if there's a fine, you can pay the fine.
Okay. Now the Forum Communications is doing fine. They can pay my fine.
Okay.
But I think we don't talk to each other, right? I mean, in when we're only getting information from one side, when you're only watching Fox News, when you're only watching MSNBC, I don't know. It's not a problem you and I are going to solve here.
It's not. It's not. I mean, I don't know. I mean, because the thing is convincing our neighbors to stop just watching Fox News, right? Or get off Facebook. I don't know how to make people do that. And by the way, I mean, we talk all the time about cable news. I was just watching this. I just saw this really interesting infographic about audience size. The number one cable news broadcaster is Tucker Carlson, who averages about 3.2 million viewers a night, right? He's number one, top of the heap. Joe Rogan has 11 million average listeners per show.
Wow.
So, I mean, there's been, and I mean, you go back like Rush Limbaugh put up big numbers like that too, right? And so, I mean, it's not like that's new, but this, I mean, I think if you started drilling down and looking at streamers and look at a lot of the way this is fragmented, it's, I mean, I used to think that was a very good thing, that the news media was sort of fragmenting and it was getting more democratized. But now I think what it's allowed is people can just sort of go to the place where they're going to hear what they want to hear and maybe not what they need to hear.
Well, and I think, going back to our conversation with the professor from NDSU about fake news and that kind of thing, my biggest concern is people who are technology native or social media, where they grew up in this world, have a better sense of what's real and what's not real than some of older folks who, they grew up in a world where you trusted Walter Cronkite and you trusted everything you read. And now there's this misinformation that, that people get so worked up about. I mean, I don't know about how many people that I know who are in fights now with their siblings. These are people in their 60s and 70s who got along forever, but they see stuff that their sister or brother posts on Facebook and they lose their mind over it. Because the stuff is so aggressive against people who disagree with them.
So I don't know. I mean, what do you think is getting back to January 6th? I mean, what do you think the end game is going to be there? Are we going to see anything consequential come out of that?
Well, I think one of my biggest frustrations is I was hopeful after January 6th that both sides would come together and do an investigation that wasn't politicized. Unfortunately, that has not happened. So whatever this committee comes up with, and there's 2 Republicans on it, but they're not Republicans that are trusted by the base, people are just going to blow it off, right? I mean, even like the Hannity text messages and some of the stuff that's so real, you can already see people trying to discredit it. I don't know what the end of this is. My hope is that responsible Republicans will look at this and say we can't have this happen again. My fear, however, is in 2024, if a Republican is elected, there is going to be a significant amount of progressives who are going to pull the same garbage because that's what the other guys did 4 years prior. That is my biggest fear.
I think that's such a danger, is it becomes almost an arms race where they did it and we condemn them when they did it, but since they did it and got away with it, now we're going to do it. And nobody's going to stand on principle anymore. And it just gets, I mean, you look at that already, what we were doing to the filibuster in the Senate. I mean, the filibuster is a good thing. It is a requirement for at least some level of bipartisanship, right? In practice, that's how it works. You got to get 60 votes if you want to move something through the Senate, which means you're going to have to get some people on the other side. I mean, unless you have a large majority, which is pretty rare in the history of the Senate.
Yep.
You got to get some people on the other side to sign off on it, right? look what we've done to it over time. You know, Democrats chipped away at it, then Republicans chipped away, and then Democrats chipped away. And we're getting to the point where the Senate's not going to be the United States Senate, the body that was set to function the way it was designed. But that's what we do. Is it's okay. You know, we're justified in doing it because they did it to us.
Yep, and I think that when you look at some of the filibuster reform that's been done in the past, the majority party really likes it at the time, but the second they're in the minority, the second the other team is using it against them on judges or whatever.
Harry Reid blowing up filibusters for judicial appointments? How did that work out under the Trump administration?
Yeah, not well.
Not
well at all.
For Democrats, anyway.
Yeah. And then you end up with federal judges that are even more partisan and more,
reactionary
on one side or the other. Yeah. And I don't know. This has been a depressing conversation.
It has been a super depressing conversation, but the January 6th thing, and I think that's the most depressing part of it for me, is that's my political movement, and people who are calling themselves conservatives are making it seem like it's just no big deal that a bunch of people stormed our Capitol and tried to overturn the election. I mean, to me, that speaks to fundamental questions about patriotism that I don't understand. But our time's up. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I actually talked to somebody a couple days ago who had been thinking about running for the legislature, a Republican, and he told me he's not because he doesn't see a place in the current Republican Party for a guy who's probably very similar to you ideologically, because he doesn't want to do the reactionary stuff. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to. And so are we pushing good people out because of the short thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I look at the way a lot of have turned on me. I mean, I have people calling me a communist now, Chad.
It's about time.
I'm a free market. I'm the same free market, small government guy I've always been. I don't want to do the culture war anymore. I just don't. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today, Chad. I think hopefully next episode we'll have something a little happy. And we did start with something very happy on this episode.
Yeah, I mean, the Jonathan Holth interview was fantastic. It really is the two states of the world in this this podcast.
It really is. Well, I mean, while all that tomfoolery is going on in Washington, we got people like Jonathan who are doing the business that we need to keep people fed, keep people employed. That's good stuff. Chad, thanks.
While raising 3 kids.
While raising 3 kids, that's right. Yeah. Chad, thanks for your time.
All right, it's fun. Thanks.